Welcome to a review of Interview with the Vampire, Season 2, Episode 2. Do you know what it means to be loved by death? So this second episode feels a little bit like a setup to things that are to follow in following episodes. Us establishing Paris as a place, establishing Louis and Claudia's relationship, and kind of like getting their first meeting of other vampires who are existing and conversing out in the world. I personally don't have a lot of opinions on it. Like, there's some stuff that could be great, and it really all depends on how it's executed at this point. Let's dive into those characters. Starting with Daniel. This is his first time he has an interesting moment in the entirety of the show so far. He continues to get belligerent and pushy with Louis, and eventually Louis gets so mad about his interruptions and his transference that he goes into Daniel's mind and brings out his worst memory. This is a super new element into Louis's character, but also into Daniel's character, where he's been very aggressive and sort of the agitator for them to be punching back and pushing back on him is interesting. And kudos to the actor, because I haven't liked Daniel's character this whole time, and I've really bought into this overly arrogant, aggressive interviewer. But this moment where he shows unsureness and sorrow and some kind of mental fog or confusion really made me feel for him and feel defensive and protective over him. The other thing interesting about this moment, Daniel seems to recover a memory of Armand messing with him and telling him information about his early childhood, possibly in his 20s when they first met. Which kind of has me wondering exactly what happened in that first interview. Moving into Armand. Modern day Armand remains pretty smug and detached from it all. He is showing a lot of affection to Louis, more than he displayed when the two of them were alone. But other than that, he does actually pull back on intensity a lot of times, whether that's Daniel being too intense or Louis being too intense, and sort of asking if they want to break or redirecting them to the main point of the interview. Sort of interesting to watch him here in this moment be a little bit of a buffer between the two of them. And then if we're talking about the Armand we meet first in Paris, I really don't feel like we got enough of a sense of him for me to form any concrete opinions. Like the books, he's instantly in love with Louis, but his relationship to the Vampire Coven is so different that it becomes really hard to parse all these internal relationship politics. In the books, Armand really doesn't like the Coven. He's very detached from them. He's so old and powerful that they kind of look at him like potentially a leader, but he's not really stepping into that role and using it. And here in the show, he is obviously the leader, beloved, interacts with the Coven, takes the reins, tell them to do stuff. He controls the shows and the production and has a lot of pride in that. It feels like the shows and the Coven and the Vampire Theater are going to be tackled in a very different way, and that's going to impart something into Armand's character, but I don't really know what that is yet. There's a lot I could pick apart. Book version Armand is a quiet, minimalist, shadowy little weirdo, and this TV show version seems to be very much a showman, appreciative of the arts, having a lot of flair. And also it seems like this TV show, Armand and Louis don't have that much in common, and that's a very interesting element when you consider this immediate insta-love the two of them have. They are continuing into a relationship, and it's a healthy, happy one in the show, versus them having an instant connection in the book, having a lot in common, and having a completely dysfunctional relationship the whole time. All these dynamics are a lot for me to pick apart. It's really too much to do in one of these recap episodes. If you wanted me to break it down into its own separate episode, let me know in those comments down below. But as it stands right now, I'm probably not going to talk further about them until I see what kind of plot points and threads they're going to pull from this new version of Armand. And speaking of the theater of vampires, let's talk about that Vampire Coven. This is a brand new, completely different coven. The one in the books is goth. They dye their hair black, they wear all black, they do their best to be very monotone, death oriented, and the same. Meanwhile, here in the show, they're just theater people doing their theater lives. So far, I've recognized the name of 3 different vampires from the vampire troupe in the book that carry over here into the TV show. Of the 3 of them, the only one that appears like they're going to be significant at this moment is Santiago. In the books, he's kind of the main antagonistic force. He's the one who's driving the witch hunt after Louis and Claudia. He's the one in charge of their mock trial and who eventually gets Claudia killed. And it's yet to be seen what will happen here in the TV show, although they are setting up like that slight antagonistic buffer between him and Louis, even if it's in a different way. This version of Santiago visually is very different and age-wise is very different, but I think like overall the way they carry themselves and the way they think of themselves is quite similar. So he's perhaps the most authentic character so far in the show. I am really curious to see how like the different values and portrayals of the Vampire Coven and the Theater of Vampires ends up. So moving on to Louis. In the present day, we do get this really interesting moment of like joy and aggression from him that we haven't seen anything similar to yet. When he breaks into Daniel's mind and basically makes him like sad and a little bit like disoriented, he has this big smug smile on his face. He does this little laugh, and it sort of portrays Louis as someone who actually enjoys cruelty, hurting other people, breaking them down. And this whole time he's kind of been like insisting that he's pro-humanity, he's doing this to save the world, and he's always been a little ambivalent about eating people. The words versus the actual actions and gestures against individual are not matching right now, and I think that's interesting and a little bit telling. And then looking at the past Louis, his character is fine. I find Louis in this episode to be a little bit flat. To me, the show has kind of like taken away a lot of what makes Louis's character special and intriguing. They're very dismissive of the long philosophical conversations, and they talk about how like they're boring or whatever and Louis is pretentious, but since we don't really see those long philosophical conversations or see Louis get like passionate or into them, I feel like number one, we're missing a huge part of what makes Interview with the Vampire and the rest of the Vampire Chronicles move. And to me, it's a little bit of a dig at what Anne Rice wrote and what the fandom likes about the books. Also, like, not including it, it kind of is like, well, what is there to Louis if not these conversations, reflection moments? They replaced it with this weird convoluted messaging about how Louis eats people and animals now. And he doesn't feel bad about the people he eats, but he also doesn't go like super out of his way to be torturous or get any like glee from hurting humanity. He doesn't love humanity the way he did in the books. He doesn't seem to love art or the natural world the way he did in the books. It's just very confusing, like mashup of inconsistencies and like hammering it out from my perspective to be like the flattest, most generic common interpretation. And you know, like for me, I don't like it because I really like weaving into those details and stuff. I'm fine with it within the context of this show, mostly because it gives us a chance to really focus on Armand and Claudia right now. And I do think there's something interesting in the show going on with Armand, and as I've said before, I just love Claudia. I think the insta-love between Louis and Armand here in the show is very weird. Since they've changed both of these characters, they don't seem to have anything in common anymore, and it feels very strange that they instantly fall madly in love with each other and like fascinated by each other. I'm not saying they can't. I'm just saying that I'm gonna need a lot more to get me to the Louis-Armand relationship. And of course, I love Claudia. I'm really enjoying this rendition of her. So far, the acting has been phenomenal. I love her facial expressions in this particular episode. Just the delight, the joy, the carefreeness, it's all over her face and it's doing so much work, and I love that. I think of all the characters, she has the most superficial characteristics that are similar to her book counterpart. Because they're superficial, they're more like Easter eggs and they aren't like anything that's worth comparing, and that's fine. The clunkiest thing to me right now with Claudia is going to be her interaction with the dressmaker Madeleine. Those of us who have read the book know that Madeleine is the woman that Louis eventually turns for Claudia within the books. And she was originally a doll maker who was charmed by her, and they kind of like fell instantly into companionship, love, understanding. Obviously, here in the TV show, they upgraded her to dressmaker because Claudia at this age would have no interest even in dolls as a pretense. And their relationship is antagonistic instead of like this instant infatuation. The way it's shoehorned in here feels weird and awkward and like it wasn't given enough time, but I realize they're probably setting it up so that we can establish the beginning of this relationship. I think they could have found a more elegant way to introduce it, or maybe to introduce it all in one episode. And it also creates this weird overfocus on Claudia's dress when she's with the Vampire Coven, but I'm willing to overlook a lot of that for right now just to see where it all goes. I do really like the different relationship that Claudia has with Louis and the exploration of that relationship as it stands right now. I love that she's totally enamored with the coven here, where she hated it in the books. I think finding that people in place and having like a high schooler's version of a theater people's trip is probably going to be fun. And I think it is very teenage, short-sighted of her to think that she can tell that one lie about Bruce being their maker and never be in danger from them and their obsession with Lestat. And lastly, I want to talk about Lestat hallucination. Probably one of the best single moments in the entire episode for me is when Louis goes to Lestat's banker. He opens the box and reads the letter Lestat must have written for him back when they were still getting along. It's really touching, it's sad, it's heart-wrenching, it's poignant. It's making you feel all those mixed emotions and really like sort of better understand Louis and where he's coming from, all together in this one very tight moment. I really loved it. And this is another example to me of like individual moments in the show when it's doing its own thing in its own way, hits it way out of the park. And I wish they'd do more of these moments and less things I could compare to the book. Some specific scenes I want to talk about. How Louis talks about Paris at the top of this episode is direct quote from the book. But like what was going on in the book versus what was going on now, I just didn't feel the use of this quote was appropriate. They yoinked it and they twisted it and they sort of forced it to be relevant to the TV show, but I wish they had just left it alone and done their own voice and tone here. Armand and Louis meeting for the first time is not as good as their meeting was in the book, number one. But number two, Armand has been talking about how Louis and Claudia have been flouting like vampire etiquette. He's mad about it. He's tired of waiting. He's gonna show them what happens when you ignore the French vampires. And he comes up, super polite gentleman, hands Louis a card, promises not to hurt him and Claudia, and leaves.
What?
Totally, that's so flippin' weird to me. In the book, the Vampire Coven and Armand, to a certain extent, do have a level of unknown threat and like a sense that they really could hurt the two of them. And I like that like horror and tension that you see in the book. And there should be some level of horror and tension here in the TV show because we know that they know Lestat and really love and care about him. But it's just like they built up to there being this moment and then it's undercut by how they actually act. And this like break from what they're saying to what we're seeing on screen again just throws the whole interview into doubt for me and makes me question what the showrunners really wanted to do or if they really understood the words they were using, and it's very frustrating. Another thing that makes me like question the creator's intent here is Daniel making a big deal about the fact that Armand and Louis both knew Lestat hundreds of years apart. In Anne Rice's books, all the vampires pretty much know each other. Like, if you're from the same city as another vampire, you know them. You might not hang out with them all the time, you might not be friends, but you've interacted in some way, shape, or form. And we know that Lestat is from Paris, meeting the Vampire Coven of Paris. Obviously, Lestat had to interact with them at some point in time. It would be more weird if he hadn't. And adding this love relationship between Armand and Lestat is actually not that odd. Armand wanted some kind of like lover-companion relationship with Lestat when they first met, and Lestat rebuffed him. So rewriting the history so that they were a couple and then not a couple anymore works. And Daniel as like the audience stand-in kind of like scoffing at it and pointing this out as like a plot hole or like too rich is something that no one who's read these books has ever felt or thought before. I just didn't like it. The other thing that I can't help but stress is like hundreds of years are in between the time that Armand had his fling and Louis had his fling. So to me, it would be a little bit like being surprised that countries at one point in time were at war with each other, and then hundreds of years down the line, the country's goals, rulers, resources shifted, and now they're allies that work together. When you look at something at that scale, everything is possible. That's the whole point of like a grand vampire timelessness sort of scale. And last but not least, I want to talk about the cult of Lestat here at the Vampire Coven. Right now, I have really mixed feelings on the level of involvement Lestat seems to have with the Vampire Coven. On one side, I understand that it significantly ups the stakes and the tension for Louis and Claudia potentially being found out as the murderers of Lestat, and I love that for them. On the other side, Lestat being involved with the Vampire Coven as their performances currently stand is icky. He was repulsed by these kinds of performances. He found them really gauche and unpleasant as a vampire in the books. And to think that now he's like participating in the star of the show further removes him from the Lestat in the books and takes his character in a more negative direction. Like, all the changes they've made to Lestat's character so far have been bad in my opinion, and this is just continuing the trend. And it's really weird to me that they would go so far to like alienate and retcon Lestat's character, given that like if we're actually going to talk about the whole span of the Vampire Chronicles, Lestat's the hero. The way they're depicting him here makes that hard. Rolling into the themes. The memory is a monster. Daniel's the one who's taking his preconceived notions and like trying to force them into the Louis Armand story. But Louis also touches on this theme a little bit when he tries to describe his first impressions with Paris and says that like his later experiences there have clouded it so much it's hard for him to separate it out and give those impressions now. The who am I supposed to love theme, right now everything is going swimmingly for Louis and Claudia, and it seems like them having people to love is like set up in a good timeline for them both to fall in love with different aspects of the Vampire Coven. So I'm not sure how they're gonna mess with that right now, because I know they have to fight and give us that moment. And then lastly, the this is not a life and that's because you took my life kind of theme. We get a little callback to that right now when we go to the Lestat flashback and his love letter to Louis. We're getting a little bit of that understanding that Lestat didn't really feel like he had much of a life before Louis, and then when Louis wouldn't continue to let him support his arts and enrichment and his hunting, again Louis was like dragging Lestat back and keeping him from the life he wanted. We also get this little bit of this feeling here where Louis is incapable of having a life either with Lestat because he makes him miserable or without him because of like this guilt and longing that he feels. And within Louis and Claudia's relationship, we're getting a little light push and pull here of a this is not a life, that's because you took my life kind of vibe. It starts with Claudia sort of like encouraging Louis to explore on his own, and Claudia feeling very burdened by the fact that her happiness is what makes Louis happy, and like that's a lot of pressure for her. And it continues a little bit where Louis is concerned about the Coven of Vampires and Claudia is like, I don't want to go on without them, I don't care about the risks or the dangers. It's just like a little setup of that potential tension that we'll probably see further down the line in this season. And that's everything I think episode 2 is really setting up for us to see. I'm really excited to see where a lot of this stuff goes. There's great potential, but talk to me, are you enjoying Interview with the Vampire season 2 so far? And what do you think is going to happen this season? Let me know in those comments down below. And if you got this far and you've got nothing else to say, leave me a bat emoji in those comments. And as always, keep reading. Bye!